In 1994, Sony would take a massive risk and enter the console market after an embarrassing betrayal by a former partner. However, no one would expect this electronic company, who prioritized in sound equipment, that they would become a household name in the console market. A partnership between Nintendo and Sony first happened when Sony engineer Ken Kutaragi, against all orders of Sony, would develop the sound chip for the Super Nintendo. Ken Kutaragi first got the idea to jump into the video game market after seeing his daughter spend so much time with the Famicom. However, he noticed the sound of the Famicom could be better. It's still wild to me that if you open an SNES, you will see Sony parts in it. After it was such a success, Sony would enter another partnership with Nintendo. This, however, would not just be for sound equipment. This would be a full-blown CD-based add-on for Nintendo's SNES console. CDs were becoming more popular and were actually cheaper to develop. They also held more data than cartridges did. The partnership was so firm that by 1991, Sony would actually publicly announce the deal, and would even make a prototype hybrid console that would play both cartridges and discs. However, Nintendo would review this contract. They realized that Sony was actually reaping all the rewards here, while Nintendo would actually lose control on software, something Nintendo is very strict about. So, without saying anything to Sony, they would quietly go to one of Sony's biggest rivals in Philips to try to reach a partnership with them. Nintendo would lend their characters to Philips for their new CDI console. I'm sure that that'll work out great for them. June 1991, at the Consumer Electronics Show with Sony in the front row, Nintendo would officially announce that Philips would be their new partner. Sony executives would be furious, especially Ken Kutaragi, who had put so much time and effort into this deal. Sony would try to reach a deal on a partnership with Sega, but Sega would say Sony was too inexperienced in the gaming market. It seemed like Kutaragi's dream to join this gaming world was over. However, Kutaragi would not back down, and with the approval of Sony's president, Norio Oga, Sony would go it alone and make their own PlayStation, and this PlayStation would be designed by Kutaragi himself. Through 91 to 94, Sony would work on their PlayStation design, and this design would be universal around the world. It was a very sleek and modern design for the time, definitely geared towards the teen demographic in my eyes. The original controller would take heavy inspiration from the SNES controller. I mean, look at them. When you lay one over top, it's the identical button layout. The only difference is the PlayStation 1 controller would have these little handles on the bottom and 4 shoulder buttons. The console would be a 32-bit system using a wide range of 3D polygons for character design, opening the possibilities for a slew of new game styles. At E3 in 1995, Sony would be showing off their PlayStation against the more experienced Sega Saturn, and Sony would go for blood.
Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, join me for a brief presentation.
This would be a response to the Sega Saturn's $399 price point announced earlier that day.
$299.
This was absolutely ruthless, and I actually kind of miss when the console wars were like this. That $299 price point would mean Sony would sell the console at a loss, but it would definitely pay off. And to be honest, most consoles do get sold at a loss. Companies don't make their money on the consoles, they make their money on the software. But with that, the PlayStation would launch in Japan December 3rd, 1994, and would be followed by North America on ENOS September 9th, 1995, and Europe on September 29th, 1995, and then all other regions thereafter. At first, Sony had to completely rely on third-party developers for their games, as at the time they didn't have a first-party development system in place. However, they did have a deep partnership with Namco, with games like Tekken and Ridge Racer. And seeing the success, this would actually draw other companies in. Sony would also get the attention of one of Nintendo's biggest partners in Square, who would bring over the Final Fantasy series and release Final Fantasy VII, which could possibly be one of the most important games that would ever release on the PlayStation 1. It absolutely put them on the map. The PlayStation had a very good launch, selling 100,000 units on its first day in Japan, and 2 million units within 6 months. Eventually, Nintendo would release the N64, showing off their new analog stick, and Sony would not be outdone, as they would see Nintendo's one analog stick and raise them another. This would be the dual analog controller. Sony would not be done with this design though, as they would reimagine it again. They would add the rumble feature, and then the two joysticks would be switched from concave to convex designs, which would be more comfortable. This is actually a design that Sony would stick with even to this day. The PS5 and the PS4 controllers were slightly different, but they were the same basic concept. But this would open the possibility for better 3D games in the future, like Spyro, Tomb Raider, Spider-Man, and more. Sony would go with the CD format that they had originally planned on, which would allow for full motion video and better sound quality. However, the load times on these PlayStation 1 games, oh my god. It's a good thing these were good games, because these load times were just awful, and these games would struggle because of them. A big selling feature though would be the fact that the PlayStation could play music CDs right out of the box, and the SCPH 1000 model would actually be sought after, as it was known to have the best sound by music enthusiasts. Sony would find great success in this venture, and would go on to sell more than 100 million units worldwide. Sony would even make a version after the PS2 was already released, dubbed the PS1, and would have a separate LCD screen, and if you haven't played on this screen, it's one of the most beautiful screens I've ever played on, and it's definitely worth every penny. The PlayStation currently sits 6th all time, and Sony shows no signs of slowing down, as they don't seem to fail at selling consoles, except for that one time, but they caught back up. My time with the PlayStation was spent usually at friends' houses playing games like SmackDown, Star Wars, Spyro, and most of the NHL games. It will always hold a place in my heart, as I have many memories with it, and I would make even more with its successor. That is the story of the PlayStation. It's a story of betrayal, perseverance, and in the end, massive success. Well, that's the end of this video. If you made it this far, please consider liking and subscribing to help this small channel grow, and I'll see you in the next video. I want to take an extra second here just to say I want to stick to my schedule of one video per week, and then I'm trying to do shorts once a day, but I am a father of 3, so be patient with me, and I'll do the best that I can. Thanks for watching.